Hey, good evening and welcome to a very special edition of Montpelier Civic Forum 2025. Tonight we're going to talk about the city budget, and we're going to talk about the city budget proposal that will be in the town meeting ballot. Now we have three people in the know and me. One of them is our mayor, Jack McCullough.
Good to see you, Richard.
The other is our assistant city manager, Kelly Murphy. And the third is our city finance director, Sarah LaCroix.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I should say right off the bat that the reason that Bill Fraser is not here deals with something within my control, and that's that Bill has commitments right now, and I wanted this filmed sooner rather than later in order to get this on earlier so that more people can watch it. So that's the reason that you get these two able people instead of Bill. Now, the budget is a really, really complicated thing. And I would ask, if you're going to watch this show about the city budget, also watch the other show about the school budget, the Montpelier Roxbury school budget. I have Libby Bonesteel talking about her budget, and that was a really good show. Now, this one, I have to ask, what is the total budget in percent? What's the increase that's being asked for this year?
Who wants to take this one?
Go ahead.
So if we're looking at the total general fund budget, it's about 18.1 million, and that's a 4.7% increase in over FY25.
What was last year's increase, off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head,
It would have been CPI at the time. It would have been about 3% and change.
Now, when I had Livy on, I asked her, what's the difference between this year's budget, which is a flat budget with no new programs, and last year's budget? How come this year's budget was able to come in at less? And she looked me right in the eye and said, simple, healthcare. It came in at 12%, and we were cheering. When you made your initial budget proposal, healthcare, can you explain healthcare to us? What the increase was, what we were anticipating? Was it higher than we anticipated? Was it much higher? And then I'm going to ask Jack to frame that in terms of recent years, how we've tried to address healthcare inflation. So the first part of this is it came in real high. How high?
go ahead.
Yeah, so the health insurance increase came in at about 22.2%. We had been meeting with the consultant who helps us work on health insurance for quite some time, and we originally expected we would be coming in around 15%. There were some changes that happened, and our experience along with Blue Cross and Blue Shield's experience, we came in at about 22.2% for this calendar year.
Now, over last year, what was last year? Do you recall off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, we had a very low percentage increase in the prior year, much lower than we had expected. So it wasn't a surprise that this increase was as large as it is. We were somewhere between 1% and 3% in the year before in increase.
Now, we're part of a pool. Jack, could you explain the pool that we're part of for our health insurance?
Well, I'm not sure that I can.
Okay, let's try one of the others.
So, I mean, I think you would need to clarify what you mean by pool.
I think we were with other municipalities, weren't we?
Nope, so we are no longer.
Okay,
so
years ago.
Yeah, so that's it was sort of a throwback. We now are on the market. We do have a broker. We are with Blue Cross Blue Shield. And so we are not currently with a pool. And so...
Why did we abandon the pool, or did the pool abandon us?
Well, it was more that there were changes in health insurance at the time, and I have to look back at the exact dates. And Jack, I don't know if you recall, was it 2015?
I don't remember the dates, but I think the way that the state municipal pool or buying structure fell apart was that when the bigger municipalities saw that we could save money by buying as a group, the insurance companies went and cut separate deals with the municipalities, so thereby undermining the pool as a whole, and so it just ceased to function as a saving mechanism for municipalities across the state.
Have they anticipated in the new Blue Cross Blue Shield that brought us up 22%? Have they talked about what next year might look like?
I mean, your guess is as good as ours. I mean, some of the increase is associated with post-pandemic experience. So if we have a heavy caseload year, that impacts what the cost on insurance is. And so we are doing our best to look at all options for health insurance to make sure we can provide a good package for our employees, but at the same time, thinking about, are there other types of packages of health insurance that we might offer that might save the city a little bit of money but not impact service for our employees? So we're looking into it. Hard to say what the increases will be. I mean, this year was pretty steep.
On the macro level, what's happening to the city and what's happening to people's own health insurance packages is that we're really subject to bigger currents in the healthcare industry in Vermont. And there's every reason to think that this is not going to be a one-year blip, that you're hearing about major healthcare providers in Vermont having financial difficulties. You're hearing about both major health insurance carriers having major difficulties. I'll be surprised if we don't see similar increases next year, and not because of anything the city's doing, but because of the economic trends in society as a whole.
As a number of individual householders are seeing the same kinds of increase.
Exactly, and everyone who gets their health insurance from their employer is probably seeing either increases in their contribution to their employer-provided insurance or other pressures on compensation because the employers are spending so much more on health insurance.
The November budget that you released, you were in the middle of November. This was after the election when Governor Scott rode to an overwhelming victory on affordability and that question. And the legislature really changed its composition in affordability. At that point, were you looking at a figure, a top-end figure? Jack, were you cut in on those discussions? In the schools, Jim Murphy was intimately working with Libby last year and this year in terms of where the board was in guiding Libby. Were you involved in that process before she released her budget in mid-November?
Under our charter, the city manager is required to submit a budget proposal to the council every year. And so that is that initial memo, and I hate to call it a proposal because nobody ever thought we were going to go as high as the bottom line was, but that was developed internally by the manager and the heads of all the departments.
Inside the city manager's office, had you vetted this with any members of council before you released it?
So if I can actually take this question a little bit. So I think, it sounds like, what you're looking for is if we had sort of guidance on a percentage, right? And, in fact, that's not really the approach that we took per se. We did have some guiding principles. And so there were some key components that council was pretty clear on, making sure that we did. So one thing was implementing the strategic plan. Another thing was investing in the capital plan. Another thing was public safety and making sure that we were prioritizing that and public works. And so we had some specific areas that we were to prioritize. And so when we brought in that budget memo, the intention was really to identify areas within the city that, in order to provide the level of service that we've become accustomed to demonstrate how much that would cost. So we, looking at, 24%, we never intended to suggest that we would actually ultimately end at 24%, But what we did want to do was make sure that we had sort of the suite of options on the table to show people, this is what it costs to provide these services. And then through the budget process, we have something that we work through internally called Budget Congress. And so we work towards consensus to come up with some options that ultimately get into the city manager's budget that come in December. And so then that rate was much more favorable, which was kind of built on a set of assumptions, and our sort of guiding light there were those principles, but then also thinking about the increase from the prior year, and then thinking about CPI and the increase in capital, knowing that capital is something that people through our surveys and just, with the flooding is really important to the city. So that's kind of the approach we took.
Could you define what capital is in this sense?
Sure. So it's all of our major projects, and so larger ticket items. And Sarah could get the specific thresholds for you if you want to get into those weedy details. But it's basically large infrastructure like water, sewer, roads, major.
Okay. Our capital
pieces.
investment. We're not
Yeah.
talking the operating budget. We're talking about the capital
no.
budget. Just one for everyone. There are two budgets that the city operates on. One is the capital budget, which is our major bridges and our capital replacement of sewers, water, and all that. And the other is our operating budget, of
Right.
which 75% roughly are personnel. And our capital budget will deal with water and sewer under the roads. The roads will be dealt with in our operating budget. That's where the asphalt.
So I think it depends, and there's a little bit of nuance there,
Sure.
right? So if it's a longer term project, that would definitely be in our capital budget. And there is a line item within the general fund for capital year-over-year investment. And so that's how we fund the capital fund. And so it is addressed within sort of the general budget. But to speak to some of the operating pieces, so if you think about the Department of Public Works, for instance, and you think about the roads, you're thinking about like sand, salt, some minor repairs, the things that, are done to make sure that, people can travel on our roadways, that kind of thing. But the major projects would be in the capital fund. So that's kind of the distinction.
How much is in this budget for roads?
So in the capital fund, let's see here, I do have that figure.
We have $725,000 in the capital fund for paving.
And that's pretty consistent with what we've done over the years. So we cut back a bit, didn't we, during the pandemic?
We had to cut. We've made up money from ARPA funds in the last couple of years, but we've been trying to build it up every year, because anybody on the council would tell you, well, that $725,000 isn't enough. We need more. We hear a lot from constituents about the quality of the roads and how we should be paving more, and we absolutely should. I agree with that. I sometimes say that the roads are like a fireworks display. It's the outcome you see is directly the result of how much money you put into it, and we'd like to be able to put more into it, but there's always tensions.
When the budget came out, there was a budgetary survey. Affordability was not mentioned in the survey at all as a priority. You had a list of different kinds of priorities, and whether it was affordable wasn't one of those priorities. Was that just an oversight, or is that the way that was drafted on purpose?
I don't think that it was purposeful. I think that it's a frame of reference. Because so with this budget and the one that we've constructed and is ultimately going to the voters, that's the intention, is to provide, the highest level of service for the least amount of cost.
Now, when the budget went before the council the first time in early December, council, looked like this. You were at that meeting, Jack. There was real surprise at the number. Before you issued that in November and it appeared in the paper, was council kind of informed of that, or was that the first time they'd seen it was in writing 2 weeks earlier?
I don't believe we saw it before it came out in our council packet. It was clear from the beginning that nobody thought we could go to the voters with a 20 or 22 or 24% increase. That was just, as I said, not a possibility, but it covered the scope of what it would cost to provide all the services that people really expect from their city government.
Now, in that budget, now these are still the assumptions to some degree. You know, the assumptions remain the assumptions. Operating costs were up 11%. Is that healthcare principally?
No.
What was that? Was that the positions that were added?
No.
What was that then?
So those are things like we've even talked about. I mean, there has been a significant increase in sort of operating supplies. So like even just thinking about the cost of sand and salt or the use of those items. So we build the budget based on trends. So there are some inflationary pressures there as well. So those are the things that, you know, we need to be able to run the city. They're all things with the exception of our personnel.
Unfunded capital needs of 1.2 million. What were those?
So a lot of that is deferred equipment. With the pandemic and with the flooding, we have had to lock down spending and conserve, and so equipment purchases, specifically DPW, is the majority that has been delayed, and so most of what is unfunded is equipment. There are some infrastructure pieces. For example, we would love to do more paving. Steady state for paving is about $1.2 million, and we have budgeted $725,000 this year. So,
And that doesn't include the fire truck that we're being asked about on the other side of the ballot.
that's correct.
Right.
But I will say that, just to get it in there, that over FY25, it's a 10% increase in paving. And so, you know, per the survey and per council's direction, we did increase that investment.
The question of almost $900,000 in additional positions in that budget, what was that about?
So in prior years, we've had reductions in the budget and positions. And so what we put back on the table this year were, you know, the positions, that have been reduced in the past. And so while that seems like a large number, and we could get into the specifics of what those positions were, they were, you know, positions that we had held vacant to be able to come in, you know, at the number that we had in the prior year. And so we just wanted to register with council, you know, the number of positions that, you know, we might want to consider adding back.
Were those filled positions or positions that were proposed?
They were vacant positions, and so they had been cut in a prior year.
Again, were those people who were cut, or were those positions
They were
that were
vacant
unfilled?
positions, unfilled.
I'm sorry, what?
Unfilled.
In terms of the delayed inflation effect, what was that?
Delayed inflation?
Yeah, you spoke of other factors included
Yeah.
a delayed inflation effect.
Yeah, so I mean, we are building a budget so far in advance of when it goes into effect that when we built this budget, you know, sort of the, you know, some of the factors were in our favor, but then, you know, when they kind of came to pass and kind of came into being, they were much higher than what we anticipated.
Increase in service demands. What was the increase in service demand that you had in mind?
Well, I can think of one in particular that's, you know, something that we think is really important, but just even the unhoused population and social services and the increased demand on our public safety services is one thing I can think of.
Did you pass the $40,000 request for the warming station?
So that actually was ARPA funding
I
that
know it
we
was.
needed to allocate, and so we did actually move a plan forward to transfer those funds to Good Samaritan Haven to provide for that warming shelter.
Do you anticipate that being in future budgets
It's
under
one-
the city?
One-time
Funding.
money and federal funding.
Do you anticipate, as federal funding is cut, that organizations with special needs in this city, they all represent special needs in our city, will come to the city asking for us to make up federal funds that are being cut? Jack?
There's not really a way to predict what organizations are going to do. I think everyone is trying to come to grips with what's going on at the federal level and how that's going to affect people in Vermont. You know, a lot of agencies in Vermont may get funds from the state government that comes down from the federal government, and so I'm very concerned that there are going to be hard times for people, kind of across the board.
Do you anticipate them coming to council to get into the city budget?
I don't have a way to predict that. What I would say is that there may not be any more money for them from the city government. I don't know, but we know what our general environment is going forward. So I don't know what what the council next year is going to be
Do you
doing.
anticipate organizations going to the back of the ballot and basically gathering signatures to have the citizens vote on replacing those federal funds?
We don't have a basis to predict what's going to happen a year from now.
Now, you guys did make some really tough decisions here in the FY25 budget. And I'm just going to read some of them. Economic development cut from 100,000 to zero. The MyRide cut from 40,000 to zero. Your public arts cut from 10,000 to zero. Social equity and justice cut from 10,000 to zero. The tree board cut from 4,000 to zero. The Conservation Commission cut from 3,500 to zero. I think we lost our AmeriCorps funding. Are there any cuts that I missed that were really tough decisions that you've already made?
So, if I might, Mayor.
Yeah.
So I think that those cuts are really difficult, but in this budget there are significant reductions to staff. And so we are, we've got one DPW position that was cut in 25 that we were talking about as part of that 900,000 that you referenced earlier that will not be restored. There's one police officer position that was cut in 25 that will not be restored. There's the executive assistant to the city manager that was just reduced and eliminated. There's the communications and program coordinator for community services that served sort of within the senior center that's been reduced and will not be replaced. There were 3 part-time employees, and then there are the AmeriCorps and Youth Conservation Corps. And I just mentioned that because that will all impact the level of service that we are able to provide.
I think the assessor moved into your office.
Yep, so we have reduced 3 part-time positions, including the treasurer, delinquent tax collector, and the assistant to the assessor, and we will be replacing that with a 1.0 position that will do both assessor assistant duties and live within finance and also do finance duties.
Now you forgot, I'm sure you remember, on the 8th when you came before council the final time, the sustainability and facilities coordinator, that position.
No, so it was something that was recommended, but ultimately was not cut.
The 17th police officer, what's the fate of that?
So, as it stands right now, it's not in. But, if we were able to find grant funding or if there were, alternatives with that, but as it stands, that's, not in the budget.
It must have been a very, very difficult budget. Did you guys get feedback on the city council budget hearings in the districts? Did you hear back what was happening in those meetings that District 1, District 2, and District 3 were holding? I was at District 2, Sal and Palin at the Senior Center, and it was a packed house, and it was very contentious. It was very hot. Jack, were you getting feedback from your council? I had heard that the one with Tim Heaney there, that was pretty contentious as well, and I think Adrian and Lawrence was. Were you getting feedback from what the public was saying at those?
This might get into something that people don't really get about how the city council works is that largely because of legal requirements of open meetings, we're not having many conversations about the things that come on the agenda outside of our meetings. I know that there's a lot of pressure from people to not to keep the budget in check, and I'm certainly hearing that in general terms. But we're not having behind-the-scenes conversations about what we should do in the budget. What people see at our city council meetings is the discussions that we have.
Was the city manager's office hearing, I know you must have been getting emails, and I know that Front Porch Forum was filled with posts. Was that registering, that sentiment registering on your level?
I mean, I think that we, maybe anecdotally or through the grapevine may have heard things, but, in terms of a structured discussion, we have those at council meetings. And so we were getting that feedback from counselors in those meetings.
The local options tax, it was not here, now it's here. Jack, could you explain what the local options tax is and why it appeared?
Sure. It was kind of a complicated story this time around, but the basic principle is that municipalities have the ability to pass a local option sales tax that is a 1% addition to the state sales tax. It applies to all the same goods and services that the state sales tax applies to, and has all the same exemptions that the state sales tax has, such as groceries and clothing and things like that. And it's been proposed before. It was on the ballot about 2012 or 2013 and didn't pass at that time. One of the things that we've heard from some people is that they're concerned that if we adopted the local option sales tax, that it would cause people to drive over to Barrie or Berlin or Waterbury or somewhere to make their purchases to save that extra penny of sales tax. Setting aside whether you think that's a valid concern or not, we're now in an environment where Barrie City, Berlin, and Waterbury have all adopted the sales tax, so that
So that
we're on an
Walmart's
equal
on
footing.
equal tax footing with our downtown.
Exactly, we're on
It
equal
would be
footing.
on
Yeah,
equal tax footing
if
with-
we adopt this, yes. Another thing that I think is very important to keep in mind, and one of the reasons that I've supported this proposal for years, is that a lot of the costs of our city, not all of them, but a lot of the costs are a result of people who come into the city to work and they use our city services, our police services, fire services, and our roads and stuff like that. The local option tax is a way to generate revenue from people who are coming in from outside of Montpelier and causing us to bear costs. And so this is a way to take some of the burden off our residents and put it on other people who are shopping in the city.
Now, Article 5 on the ballot has moves Montpelier Alive out of the core ballot, out of the core operating budget, and puts it into this fund instead, which saves $50,000 in the core operating budget. Montpelier Alive moves into this. They're held harmless and moves into here. And then $100,000 will go to infrastructure projects. There's more to be generated, projected, than $150,000. What happens to the rest?
Well, the projection right now is for $500,000 to $600,000, and that's based on the fiscal 2024 fiscal year. So that's based on actual sales tax revenues during the flood year from July 2023 to June 2024. So I think we can really expect more revenue to be generated, but we're trying to be conservative with what we expect. It's money that comes into the city that the council will have to decide how to allocate it. we couldn't put it into this year's budget, of course, because we didn't know
It's
if it was going to
speculative.
pass. Yeah, but for the first year, we decided we would commit the $50,000 to Montpelier Alive, $100,000 to infrastructure, and that leaves us with more money to determine how we will spend it. And so that'll be decided by the new council after the election, and we know whether we have that money to spend.
Article 10 is mystifying to many people. The voters shall appropriate the sum of $37.50 used by the Mosaic Vermont for the blah, 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 blah. Jack, this is a technical adjustment. Can you explain to people what Article 10's technical adjustment is?
I might not be the best person.
So the Mosaic, it's not a technical adjustment. It supports a local nonprofit. Is that the question you need to ask?
The one on behalf of the industrial and commercial real estate property and alternate energy
Yep, so
plans.
those are two separate questions.
Yeah, it's a separate question. I'm
Yep.
sorry, I merged those. That's the one. Mosaic is someone put that on the ballot.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
Jack, what's the one that deals with alternative generating plants and all that? That's just mystifying to people.
I think you're talking about the tax stabilization
Exactly.
proposal. Yes.
Kelly, can you explain what
I'm going
this
to
is
actually
about?
have Jack go ahead and explain it.
Sure. For years, Montpelier's had a tax stabilization policy, and it enables us to hold the property tax level when a property owner plans to make certain improvements to their property. And it could be, as you said, alternative energy, it could be housing, there's a number of things. There used to be a state-imposed cap on the amount of assessed value that we could apply to the tax stabilization policy. The legislature recently amended the statute so that it could be applied to the entire 100% of the assessed value of the property. And so this is a proposal to allow us to enter into a tax stabilization agreement up to the state-imposed limit. And then if we ever come to a point where we're discussing a tax stabilization agreement with a particular property owner, that would come before the council would evaluate it on its merits, and but we would not have that cap.
So this is a technical adjustment to give us more flexibility as a city.
Exactly.
But should we use that flexibility to its fullest, it would go before council,
Right.
if I'm interpreting that correctly. Article 13 has generated a lot of attention. And I'm just going to begin with, shall the voters of the city of Montpelier advise the mayor and city council to adopt the following pledge? We affirm our commitment to freedom, justice, and equality for the Palestinian people, et cetera, et cetera. There are people in the community who are calling this baldly anti-Semitic. It's a democratic process. They got their signatures to get on the ballot. If this were framed a different way, and it were framed that in this city we will no longer recognize anything but two genders, and that people will have to go into the bathroom of their gender of birth, and that the city clerk would not issue same-sex marriage licenses, would that make the ballot? Are we so libertarian that anything will make the ballot?
Well, let me answer that in a couple of ways. One is that you read off the first sentence of the proposal and then said, et cetera, et cetera. And really, I think the big concern is what falls within that et cetera, et cetera. And if you read all the way to the bottom, you will see that it appears well down in the proposal to actually call for the eradication of the state of Israel.
I was just about to say, yeah, exactly.
If that's not anti-Semitic, I don't know what is, and I think there's going to be a lot of opposition to that. On maybe on a and intend to oppose it myself. On a more, on a broader aspect, the question is, what's the obligation of the city when presented with a proposal to put something on the ballot? And back in 1992, there was a proposal in Montpelier and a lot of cities around the state. It was referred to as the tax dividend. And the idea was that the Soviet Union is no more, we can afford to reduce our military budget and then put the savings into other human needs. In Montpelier, a sufficient number of people signed the petition, brought it to the council, and the city council said, no, we're not going to put it on the ballot. And at that time, I wasn't on the council, and some of the people who signed the petition came to me, and we actually sued the city council and mayor.
We, being?
We, mean I represented the plaintiffs suing the city council saying, you don't have this option. The state law requires you to put it on the ballot if you get the right number of signatures, and we received an injunction in Superior Court requiring the city to put it on the ballot. And so, in my opinion, that's the state of the law requiring us to put it on the ballot, even if it's something that we disagree with or find abhorrent.
Kelly, I have a follow-up on the unhoused.
Mm-hmm.
Who has authority over the question of possible encampments in Hubbard Park? Is it the elected city council or is it the elected Parks Commission?
So, I mean, we have an encampment policy that we follow citywide. That policy is a policy of city council. So I think it depends on, what kind of situation is happening, whether or not, it's in the parks. How you cited Hubbard Park, for example, but I mean, we would use that policy.
Now, at one point, Jack, we talked about, because I know it was on my show, it was Donna Bate, was talking about a joint city parks policy dealing with dogs, and having some people from both bodies sitting and trying to figure out that issue. Have we considered a joint policy between parks and the city on homeless?
I have not heard that suggested as a way to go.
It's a decent suggestion.
In the last year, you probably know that the Parks Commission did adopt a policy on dogs that...
No, I'm not talking about dogs. I'm talking about the unhoused.
I know. I would say that there are tensions between the needs of park users, the needs of people to have a place to go, and there are a lot of competing values. The city's encampment policy, as much as anything, is not really saying who can camp where, as saying these are our directions to city employees when they come into contact with people who are parking, because nobody wants to be punitive. Nobody wants to be unwelcoming to people who need a place to go.
Now that I've got you three here, the Elks Club and the Country Club property, what is going on right now vis-a-vis a recreation facility located up there, possibly located up there? Kelly?
So at the last council meeting, we did have a discussion about that property and potential recreation there, in a potential community center. And so at this point, we are going to be working with community partners to develop proposals. And so that's what I can say at this time for that site and that purpose.
Jack, what's going on with the TIF?
It's a complicated process, but and we've been working. There are a couple of steps that have to happen before we get to a tax increment financing district, and one of them is to amend our growth center designation. We hit a little bump in the road earlier this year. We're continuing to move forward, and our plan is to move forward with tax increment financing so that when the time comes to find developers for mostly for the housing development on Country Club Road, that we can present them with land that already has engineering and infrastructure, so that they're not, a potential developer isn't scared off by those costs.
Kelly, does it look like we'll meet the first round? I think it's sometime in the fall.
We'll certainly see. I don't have any new information for you at this point.
First of all, I want to thank our city finance director, our assistant city manager, and our mayor for being here tonight. And I want to tell you, to watch all of the shows, it's a particularly good year for these shows. And make sure you get out and vote. And that doesn't simply mean get out on town meeting day. If you want to, you can vote early, and please feel free to do so. But your vote is empowering and your vote has meaning. Thank you for watching.